Hello, everybody. First, thank you so much for being here today. And I'm so happy to have Bala here. Bala is, she is operating on an entirely different plane than many of us are. And that's a compliment, of course. And I've been learning about Bala's work, learning about a whole new world that is surrounding us, beneath our feet, in the air around us, and has all kinds of, let's say, real-world applications, as that saying goes. So, Bala, I wanted to just start by, could you describe for us, within your research area, what are some of the aspects that interest you the most about the notion of this former golf course partially being left to its own devices?
Yeah, sure. So first, let me just explain a little bit about, in general, what we study in my research group here. So we study mycorrhizal symbioses, and mycorrhizal symbioses are relationships between plants and fungi below ground. So typically when we think of fungi, we think of death and decomposition and maybe the mold on the old food in your refrigerator. But fungi play lots of different roles in ecosystems, and they play many beneficial roles in ecosystems. So the fungi that live on and in plant roots are doing this essentially to help all of the plants and the trees that we see around us. So some people say plants don't have roots, they have mycorrhizas. So almost all plants in the world are forming these associations with fungi. And they do this almost like a biological fertilizer. So the fungi provide increased access to nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil, give it to the plant in exchange for sugars that the plant makes through photosynthesis. And so because this is a nutritional, beneficial association that most plants on Earth make, when we're thinking about conserving ecosystems and restoring ecosystems, we not only want to restore the organisms that we can see above ground, we also want to think about the beneficial below ground organisms that we can't always see. But because we can't see them, it's a little tricky sometimes. So in my lab, we study what are the best ways to restore mycorrhizal symbioses below ground in a conservation setting, in an urban remediation setting, in sustainable agriculture. How can we restore healthy below ground ecosystems? Now, the golf course is a great case study because we know that many of the practices that go on with traditional golf course maintenance, like irrigation, herbicide use, pesticide use, those can depress healthy mycorrhizal communities. And so we want to know if we're interested in rewilding or restoring an area, are the mycorrhizal fungi coming back on their own? Or do they need a little help from humans through active restoration of soil microbial communities? So we do a lot of experimentation in my lab to see when you restore actively mycorrhizal fungi, does it change the community? How does it change? And what are the benefits to the ecosystem in that process?
I remember, I think we were talking once, maybe in the spring, you had mentioned to me this notion of there isn't really such a thing as the rewilding or restoration, that ultimately it needs to be thought of and considered as a novel ecosystem.
Yeah, there are lots of schools of thought in restoration ecology or in the field of rewilding. Some would say that you're not necessarily interested in going back to how an ecosystem used to be. So a remnant or a historic state really isn't what we're aiming for anymore. because essentially there's really no place on Earth that's untouched by humans, particularly with climate change. And so much of restoration and rewilding is thinking about creating or planning a novel or new ecosystem that will be able to be resilient in the future as our climate changes.
And since we just came from the Hamadryad piece in the tree, could you describe to us, I'll just say I often think of your field as all underground, dark, a little bit damp, a little bit sinister. But they're actually, the fungi are all around us, aren't they, even in the air?
Yeah, that's right. And that was one finding that came out of my lab in the last few years, was that many of these fungi do make mushrooms above ground and release spores into the air. And certainly if you're interested in fungi or see mushrooms out on a hike in the upper valley, those are above ground. But most of the fungi in association with plants and trees don't ever form structures above ground. So how can they disperse or get into new areas? So one of the things that we do in my lab is we have a network of dust collectors or samplers that we have set up kind of all over in this area, but really all over the United States, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, now Greenland, and we've found lots of mycorrhizal fungi in these air samplers. And at first everybody, the scientific community said, "Are you sure that's impossible?" And it was really one of the, as a scientist, you don't have a lot of eureka moments, where you're looking through the microscope and you see a finding and think, oh, this is it, I've made a discovery. So this was a really exciting discovery that we made in the lab, that these below ground organisms actually can be found in aerial samplers. And so they're, thinking about the Hamadryad, they're floating around, they're flying around the limbs of trees and through the air, and landing in new locations and potentially forming new mycorrhizas where they wouldn't have been able to before. Now the question is, how do they get in the air? And that's a very active area of research in my lab, and we think that actually human disturbance activities play a big part in that. So for example, disturbance that comes with agriculture in the fall when it's harvest time, potentially mining activities or construction activities can kind of kick the soil into the air, and the fungi catch the wind and just go, sometimes, thousands of miles away.
So tell us a little bit about pathogenic fungi.
Yeah, so pathogenic fungi are something that we're starting to look at in my lab. And there certainly is the opportunity for tracking and searching for some fungi that are pathogens on plants. More so on plants, less so on humans. There are a few soil-borne human pathogens, but there is a big risk to plants, in particular the plants that we rely on for food. So we are all unfortunately now familiar with pandemics, human pandemics, but there also can be food or crop pandemics, where certain crops that are grown globally can be impacted by pathogens if they have the ability to spread long distances.
Before I see if anybody else has questions for you, I wonder, what do you see as similar in our work? What are some of the similarities between what you've just all experienced together and the work you do in the lab?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why I love talking to you and working with you, because at the core, we both study movement. And we study movement from very different perspectives. And I think when you're trying to address challenges, environmental challenges like we do in my lab, or trying to understand better ways to communicate with people, reach people, touch people, change hearts and minds. I think we need very unique perspectives, and we need really out of the box perspectives. So that's why I enjoy hanging out with you, because it just helps thinking about problems in a new and interesting way.
Any questions for Bala or for me? Any questions about these microbial movements?
So I liked your answer about rewilding, because I always wondered if you were trying to go back, how far do you go back? We're talking about 500 years, pre-European invasion, or are we talking about before the last ice age? It seems very arbitrary, but if you're really creating a new, but hopefully sustainable and stable environment, then that requires a lot of knowledge we don't have yet.
Yeah, I agree. One of the areas that we work in my lab is in green roofs. So green roofs are vegetated surfaces of rooftops that are installed in urban areas in order to insulate buildings, cool neighborhoods, absorb stormwater. And the type of plant community or vegetation that you put onto a green roof, do you choose the native community from that area? That would be very challenging around here to plant an eastern deciduous forest on a rooftop, and it might not achieve the functions and services you're after. And so really it's about creating novel ecosystems that provide urban green functions that you want, but also are native and can promote native pollinators and other native wildlife. So it really is a new novel creation in that setting.
In that same vein, in the third piece, the bright splash of color in the middle of the is invasive purple loosestrife. How does the knowledge that it's invasive affect you as artists when you think of it as being a bright splash of color, but it doesn't belong?
That's a great question. I would say a few things. First of all, the inspiration for the trio, as you might have read in the program, the trio is entitled Trophic Cascade. And it's something I learned about this past year at Dartmouth, this notion of these disruptors in ecosystems. And a very small disruptor can completely turn an ecosystem's food chain on its head. So inevitably, one species, subspecies could disappear, others could become more dominant. So actually when we were making the piece, we really never had such happy thoughts as a bright splash of color. We were working more with images like Squid Game, like something is going to be eliminated in this round. That was kind of our thinking with the Trophic Cascade. There's something a bit, darker about it, right? Now, the disruptors aren't always humans, pesticides, etc. It could be drought or wildfire or flooding. But in this particular case, we were wondering, and we haven't been able to really talk to anybody to tell us what the plans are for the future of the former golf course. And so I wonder what's been happening. I've been very curious about that marsh. Did somebody plant anything there? Was it, I don't play golf, so this might not be the proper term, but was it a sand pit? Those kind of sandy pits you see on a golf course? No one seems to know, so I wondered if something was planted there, or if it was just left to do its own thing. Seems a little unlikely. There seems to be a lot of species in there. So we were thinking of all these things. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say that the invasive species and the trophic cascade are inextricably linked. And there's a concept in ecology we talk about, invasional meltdown, where one invasive species will come in and result in essentially a trophic cascade that leads another invasive species to come in and another invasive species to come in, because upon invasion they're literally changing the environment, and then it's this downward spiral that leads to really dramatic losses in native biodiversity.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Question?
Yes.
You said that fungi are in most places. Does that include the desert, or is that like the one place where they don't exist?
Very good question. Yeah, sorry. The question is that I said that fungi are in most places. Does that include deserts, or are deserts the one place that fungi don't exist? And very intelligent question. I can tell you've got good genes. That's my son.
Was that a? Is this a
It was
plant?
not a plant. No, it was not a plant. Interestingly, the same thing happens when they come to my lectures here and there. So to answer your question first, before we go to the sibling, is there are tons of fungi in the desert. They're often very different species, and actually sometimes people think of deserts as less biologically active. That's not true. Deserts are incredibly biodiverse. They're just less productive. So you have lots of different species in a small area, lots of species turnover, huge gradients, and so there's a huge amount of fungi in the desert, and they associate with plants, and they're all over.
Amazing.
Yes?
Would you consider yourself a fun guy?
Oh, no.
Adorable. Any other? Yes.
I do. It's less of a scientific question, although perhaps you can make it that. I was looking at the emotion in the pieces, and for me, as I watched the first four, there's a lot of pain, which made a lot of sense to me, based on kind of what you're moving us to do, both between the dance and the science, right? To really be getting in touch with the need to be more aware of the planet and how we're interacting with what we're doing to it and what it means for us. The fourth piece, there was a great deal of joy for me as a witness to it, just a marked difference. And I was just curious if you were willing to talk to us about your own process in the dancers and the two.
Sure. I think, I do feel that each of the dancers has a very specific narrative and character to develop. For instance, our first piece, Celeste Hastings is the osprey. We have first of all, I learned, one of the reasons we made that piece, I learned here this past year in talking with different people that the osprey population has come back to this region, that it had almost disappeared completely due to DDT and other pesticides. So I just kind of ruminate on those images, and then I knew I wanted Celeste to work in this osprey mode, and what does a biped do when she's performing as a bird? And so a lot of our imagery was actually for her quite dark, that she can no longer fly. So what does that mean to this osprey? Because osprey fish, and so she can no longer swim and fly and fish, and so some real kind of life or death questions this particular osprey has in that little cove on the pond. I think second piece with Akua Noni Parker, the Sacred Grove, that the prevailing image for her is this notion that she is some kind of priestess protecting this circle around this triangle of trees. Trophic Cascade, the next piece we spoke about. Amaterasu is a very complicated Japanese mythological figure who brings sun to the world, and she's the only, Amaterasu is really the only
global mythological sun goddess. They're mainly male. Maybe it's because of that she has a particularly complicated backstory. Very vain, very lonely, very kind of troubled family life. And yet she persists and brings sun to the world. And she's just a fascinating, complicated character. And Peju, who performed it, has been with a principal dancer for many years with the Graham Company. So she's played a lot and invested a lot in some very complicated roles of many complicated women. So she can go right for that. And as you say, the Hamadryad, the last piece, is a bit brighter and lighter. For a bunch of reasons. That seems to be the prevailing, if you look into the literature and the Greek myths, that seems to be the prevailing affect of this Hamadryad, that she is very beloved, very beautiful, loves dancing, particularly when there's a full moon. So most everything you would encounter about the tree nymph, about this particular Hamadryad, is very effervescent, very light, very upbeat, very positive. Yeah, you can't find much darkness around the Hamadryad character. The only thing I've ever come across was the notion that, and it does make her different, she's not mortal. I mean, excuse me, she's not immortal if her tree is felled. Hit by lightning, whatever, for some reason the tree is killed, she dies with it. But we have no record of that happening. Absolutely.
Can I add to that just a little? I think when thinking about the environment and different crises, there is an inevitability that sometimes we go to despair. So there's climate despair is a real problem. Particularly, I'm in the environmental studies department, and so many of our students come in with a lot of climate grief. And as educators, I think we do our best to really demonstrate how much opportunity there is for action if we are not crippled by grief. And there are so many actionable solutions to environmental crises, whether it's climate or water or food or biodiversity loss. There's so much that can be done if we have the social and political will, whether you want to engage through policy or science or technology. And so that, I don't see a lot of despair, actually. And as educators, it's something that we really work with students on, is don't be crippled by your grief, because there's so much we can all do.
Beautiful. I think we'll end with one more question.
I was just curious, because I saw yesterday's, if there were other sites around the Dartmouth that you considered, and if so, how you eliminated them, or what your thoughts are about them, and why you chose them.
Great question. Why the choice of these sites? There were a few other sites I was looking at. For instance, the elm trees, the statuesque trees all around the quad. I thought that would be a beautiful site. And then we learned that they're rather sickly. With Dutch elm, is that what it's called? Dutch elm disease, maybe something else. Some of them even get antibiotics and vaccines.
They've been treated by fungicides for many years, but and they're among the few American elms that exist anywhere because of their constant care.
Which is, yeah.
So they're very fragile.
They're too fragile for us to work with. So And one would never know that just walking by and seeing these majestic, giant elm trees. So we were thinking about that. We even looked along the river, but we ultimately felt that this configuration was the most audience friendly. It would have taken quite a while to get down on the path to the river and then back up, etc., etc. And then I'm very, very drawn to the notion of this golf course, this former golf course, and just so curious about what is next for this former golf course and the potential of this space and place. So that's when we settled on this configuration. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Bala.
Thank you.